Specifically, what I was asked to talk about a little bit today was about racism, because that is a topic that is very much in the forefront of our minds right now. It's on the media, it's in conversations that we're having with people. And as a church, many churches are responding and many Christian leaders are responding to what's been happening, especially in America. If you're not even in America, I'm sure you've seen on the news the amount of unrest and turmoil and protests and conversations that have been happening here. And so there has been a bit of a pickup and a movement. And so we just wanted to take some time to address those things. Even as I'm talking today, I'm not talking as somebody who is an expert. I'm talking as somebody who is figuring things out for myself personally, as well. And somebody who is growing in this, and somebody who is constantly reminded of how weak I am, but how great Christ is and how his grace is sufficient enough for me. And so as we have this conversation, I'll just ask for grace on your end, as you listen and as you discuss and process things, and we'll have grace for each other, because this is what it says in Ephesians. It says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not on your own doing. It is a gift of God. And it's not by works, so that no one can boast this." And so Paul just starts us off right off the bat here. And he's saying that even our salvation is a gift of grace from God, because there's no way that we could have measured up and became the perfect people that we were meant to be. But God has given us his grace. And as we have these hard conversations today, and I'm hoping over the next few weeks, as you engage with other people, I pray that we have this stability of grace that is what allows us to have these conversations in a way that is civil, in a way that is Christ-oriented, and that's biblical. Because if we don't do that, then there is no difference between us as Christians talking about this and the world talking about these issues. So we are a people of grace, and that is where we start, and that is where we end. And so today we'll be talking a little bit about racism, and I just want to start off with the point of racism as a sin. So racism as a sin. And so what I've been hearing from certain people is, how important is it to talk about this, especially as people who are living in America or other countries as immigrant kids, and as people who are dealing with the effects of it, but maybe we're not comfortable or we're not used to having the kind of dialogue that is happening right now. And so how important is it to talk about it? And I think it's so crucial, because there are certain crucial things in life that we just can't stop talking about, right? Because we can't say that if we stop talking about COVID-19, that is just going to go away. Like, we know that that's not true. We know that we need to continue telling people, no, you still need to have a mask. You still need to separate yourselves. You still need to make sure you do the right things, because if we just stop talking about it, it's not going to go away, right? And so it's so important for us that we're having this conversation. And so I believe, biblically speaking, that racism inherently is evil, and that it's a sin. It's not what God intended for us. And how do we know that? So racism as a sin, it begins with the recognition that our world has departed devastatingly from God's divine design. That our world has departed devastatingly from God's divine design. And relationships tend not to be right between us and the Creator, between us and creation, between our own selves, and between one another. And so if we can just break this down and start from the beginning for a little bit. Genesis chapter 1, we all know the story. God was creating the heavens and the earth, and he created everything beautifully and wonderfully, and he created humans in his own image. And he looked at everything and said, hey, this is pretty good. I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. He said, this is very good for humans. And so everything was perfect in how God intended it to be. It was peaceful. There was a unique relationship between God and humans and creation. Adam was just walking around, naming animals, hanging out with them. Creation was how it was meant to be. Then quickly we see just a few chapters in Genesis 3, sin enters the world as Satan deceives Adam and Eve with a lie that God is holding out on them and he doesn't want the best for them. And that breaks and distorts the perfect world that God created. And now everything that we're seeing and experiencing, the brokenness we're seeing and experiencing, is a direct result of that sin. But God, being gracious and kind, didn't leave us there. He promised that he would send somebody to revert all the brokenness that we've caused, that he would find a way, that he would send an heir who would crush the heel of the serpent and who would create an opportunity for us to have a relationship with him. And that one day, right now we're in that tension, that one day when Christ will come back and everything will be the intended design that God has originally planned for it to be. But until then, this is where we find ourselves, these four things. We have broken relationships, off relationships between us and our creator, meaning God. And that is only found, that kind of stable and holy and perfect relationship is only found through a relationship with Jesus. We see a broken relationship between us and creation, and we can see that even now with so many things happening to our world and nature. We see that even like in hurricanes and earthquakes, and we see that in so many things that even we as humans have contributed to our world. We see that broken relationship, that not right relationship between us and our own selves. And specifically, as I was thinking about this, as we talk about racism, for so many of people of color and for people, especially Black Americans, there is a internalized kind of racism that we hear from society saying that you are less than, you can never be this, you have so much more to go, we're constricting you here. And it changes after hearing those things for so long, it changes the relationship that you have with yourself, right? And then it also shows that we don't have a correct relationship between us and one another, and that's where racism comes into play. And so all of these things, I just want to flat out start with this, that biblically, sin is the foundation and the root issue for racism, for seeing other people as less than human, for not seeing other people as the image of God, as God said he created all of us to be, for putting ourselves on a higher pedestal and not loving our neighbor in the same way that we love ourselves, for thinking that we're better than certain people, and for other people thinking that they're better than us, and for creating systems to oppress certain people. All of these things fundamentally come from the sin of racism, and God cares deeply about sin. He cares about it so much that he sent his son to die on a cross, who protested on a cross, we just heard, who was whipped and beaten, who was spit on and mocked, and who died a death that none of us would want to die. God cared for sin that much that he sent Jesus to do that for us. And so today, as we talk about racism and as we talk about the brokenness of sin, it's important that we have the perspective of the weight of sin and how much God cares about it. And that is why it's our responsibility as Christians then to care about it, because God does. And so that's where we're starting off for today. I just want to talk a little bit about my own personal experience. This is a picture of when I graduated from college. I graduated from a small private university in Austin, Texas, and I studied religious education in order for me to work at a church. And that's what I've been doing right now for 4 years in the Bay Area, working with youth and young people and in the music department as well, and overseeing that. But this was my, about 10 of us here, this was my small graduating class for my major. And as you can see, I'm pretty easy to spot in this picture. And I don't know about you guys and how your experiences have been in school or in work or in other settings, maybe even in church, if you go to a non-Habesha church. We all have our own experiences when we're talking about race and racism. And they're very unique, considering that we are children of immigrants. So for a lot of us, either we moved here when we were younger, or we were the first person in our family, maybe born in the States. And so we're not very far removed from our culture. And so for a lot of us, we're considered that 1.5 or second generation. And we're an awkward blend of like Habesha and American. Like certain words we say in Tigrinya, even though we're in English, and your American friends are like, what are you saying? Or you just have certain habits, the way that you talk to older people, or just the way that you view life may be different from your American friends. And that's what makes our first and second generation Americans, especially as Eritrean or Ethiopian Americans, very unique. And so a lot of my school experiences looked like this. Growing up, from a very young age, my parents wanted me to go to the best school. As I'm sure a lot of Habesha parents, education is very important. And so my parents did as much as they could to put me in the best schools. And that looked like most of the time being the only person of color in those schools. And so starting from elementary, middle, high school, this is typically what I was used to. And even in college with my graduating class, all of these people are lovely people. They've become some of my closest friends. All of us are serving in churches throughout the country and throughout the world. But still, the way that people treated me, there is a difference, because just from far away, certain people would see me and they'd be like, oh, that's a person of color, that's a Black person. They come closer to me, they're like, are you Indian? Or where exactly are you from? They can't peg you. And then they look at your hair and they're like, wait, so how does this work? Where are you from? And then you start talking, and then it just throws everybody off, right? And so as somebody who is an Eritrean American, we have at some point probably experienced what stereotyping or discrimination or racism means. We've experienced it. I personally experienced it by people judging the way that I talk. And by that way, saying that they expect certain things from me, or people just by seeing who I was, a person of color in a predominantly white school or a church setting, assuming certain things about me. I feel like at some points we've all wrestled with this kind of tension. And while being a Habesha American or Habesha Australian, wherever you are, may look different, and while we all face those stereotypes or discrimination, I feel personally that it is not nowhere near, but very different from the experience of people who are Black Americans. While we are Black, most of the time, like I said, when people see me, they're really confused. They're thrown off by who I am. They're thrown off by my culture and my hair and what I look like. And they can't put me in that box that they want to put me in. But I also want to just take us a step further and make us all a little bit more uncomfortable, if that's okay. And just talk about how many times in my experience in ministry, especially working with American people, but also with Habesha people, and hearing parents tell their kids, their young kids, oh, don't hang out with this person, hang out with this person, because the person that they didn't want their kid to hang out with was Black. What does that say to a kid? What are you teaching your kid in that moment? And sure, that can be out of fear, that can be out of a lot of reasons, but there's something, a deep thing that is internalized in that statement that you are passing on to your kid in that moment. I'll share another story just to make us all equally a little bit more uncomfortable. My director of the program that I graduated from, his name was Jake. And Jake is awesome. He married a Taiwanese lady. He's traveled all over the world. He's interested in cultures. And a few months ago, I saw him, and he came up to me and he said, Abby, you know, I learned something new about immigrant families and immigrant parents. And I was like, great, teach me, Jake. And he said, something I learned was, if you're an immigrant kid, if you were born and raised in America, you're the first generation in America, your parents want you to get married. And I was like, yeah, that's true. That's all they talk about. And he said, they want you to get married. The most important thing is they want you to marry from your tribe. And I was like, okay, I could see how that's very important. He said, if not, from your country. And I was like, okay, I could see how that's typically how it goes. And then he said, if not, try to marry somebody who's American, like white American, is what he said. And I was like, okay, sure. And then he put all of these other things. And then he said, I see a real issue with African Americans, and an issue with parents struggling with finding that okay for their kids. And I said, Jake, I think you've hit the nail on the head on this one. I think we have so many deep issues when it comes to judging people and discriminating against people and calling out what is within us as a culture and as a people, as Americans, as Habeshas, but most importantly as Christians. And it shows how we view the people that God said, you are made in my image. And he died for them. And his blood covers them, and they're made new in him. And his Holy Spirit is reigning and dwelling in them, people of value, people who are imago Dei, image of God. And so these are the things that I want us to think about, because I know that we are a group from all over the world, and we feel our own burden when it comes to racism and discrimination, but we also need to be a people because we are a people of grace, knowing that God has given us an infinite amount of grace. We have then the ability to repent of our sin freely, knowing that there is enough grace to catch us when we fall. That God is opening his arms and welcoming us, knowing our sins already, that we can come to him and say, Father, forgive me. I have sinned against you in my thoughts, in my words, in my actions, by what I've done and by what I haven't done. And we're only able to do that because we know the grace that God has given us as Christians. And so what I just wanted to quickly throw out before my time runs out is these two things: that profiling and discrimination is real, and that privilege is real. And then I'll jump into some verses to support that. Like I said earlier, people sometimes look at certain people, and based off of how they look, or based off of how they're dressed, or based off of certain things on the outside, they assume a certain amount of things. They assume that they're going to be this type of way. And that is profiling and discrimination, and that is real. But privilege is also real. And that's what I want to talk to us specifically about today, because we hear about privilege most of the time as white privilege, but all of us have been given privilege, because there's different kinds of privilege that we have. An example of different kinds of privilege is, one, in education. If you're educated and you've had the blessing to be able to go to school and get degrees, that is a privilege. If you are from a certain socioeconomic status, that is a privilege. If you have a high position, maybe in your workplace, that is a privilege. If you have a highly connected network, if you know a lot of people, if you're the person who you can make a call and you can make something happen, that is a privilege. We all have certain privileges. Let me give you an example. A man that I know, he's a Habesha guy. He came to the States when he was maybe 15, ended up going to a university in Texas, and now has a very successful career. While he was at the university, he joined a fraternity. And so for those of you guys who are maybe from all over the world, in America, we have these things at universities called sororities and fraternities. I never personally got them. I went to a small university. We didn't have them. And so every time I see somebody in a sorority or fraternity, first of all, I'm jealous by the connection that they have. So what they do is they have 4 years of living together like a family. They look out for one another, they support one another, and even after they graduate, they stay connected, they network, and they have relationships based off of their jobs and common interests, and they continue to support each other, because if you're in a fraternity, they're your brothers, and if you're in a sorority, those are your sisters. They continue to support each other. And so that person ended up joining a fraternity. He started his own practice. He got married, had kids. It was time for his kids to go to university. When his kid wanted to go to a certain university, and when he wanted to join a fraternity, he made one call and his kid was accepted. When his kid was looking for an internship in order to get into this place in engineering, he made one call for a fraternity brother, and that kid was accepted into an internship. When a few years ago, I got into a car accident and needed legal advice, I asked him, and he called one of his friends who's a lawyer from that fraternity, and he gave me legal advice. I was a blessing of that. I received a blessing from that kind of privilege. And so I think a lot of times we hear about certain types of privilege, such as white privilege, but we forget that all of us have certain privileges that we have been given. And we use those privileges for the benefit of others. So one thing I want to encourage us to do is let's take stock of the privileges that we have. If you're a well-connected person, if you're a person who is educated, if you're a person who has authority in your workplace, take stock of the privileges you have and use it to benefit others who don't have those privileges. Use it to benefit others that society overlooks them. They underestimate their talent or their value because of multiple reasons that are not godly and not biblical. But us as Christians, we've been given privileges. We have been given the blessings of Christ first and foremost, but we've been given privileges in this world, and our calling as Christians is to use them to the benefit of others, to uplift those who the world may put down. Dowie quoted him earlier, but Martin Luther said this: "You are powerful, not that you may make the weak weaker by oppression, but that you may make them powerful by raising them up and defending them." This is our calling as Christians. God takes justice seriously, and he calls us to lift others up with what we have, to be generous with what we have, and to see the people that society is not seeing, and to show them how Jesus sees them, to treat them in such a way. Another quote that I like is, "The gospel is the great equalizer." The gospel is the great equalizer. Because for the one who thinks he is greatest, and for the one who thinks that everybody else is beneath them, the gospel comes and he says, no, actually, you were saved by grace, not of your works so that you can boast. You needed God's grace, and it levels him. And for the one that says, I'm so broken, I could never make it, I don't have any worth, I don't see where I'm going, the gospel comes and says, Christ sees you and he died for you. And his grace lifts him up. And the gospel is the great equalizer because it puts us all on this level playing field and says we're all equally in need of grace. We're all equally made in the image of God. And it's when we understand that we can use what we have to bring reconciliation into this world that needs it. And so the question for us today is, so what now? As Christians, what do we do? What are we called to do? And what I would humbly suggest is, one, as Christians, we are called to engage with a Christian conviction. We hear the phrase a lot, be in the world, not of the world. What does that mean? I feel like a lot of times we say that we're not of the world, but we forget that we're supposed to be in it. If we are not radically sharing, and I say radically because it is a radical idea, that God sees every human and sees worth in every human and has died for us. If we're not spreading that, if we're not sharing that with people and saying that all people are made in the image of God, then the world is going to miss out. This movement is going to miss out. But at the same time, if we conform to all of the values of all of the movements and we forget about what biblical justice is, then we risk our conviction and we're not a true witness in the way that God's calling us to be. So I truly believe as Christians, we are called to have a voice and to be in this world, to tell people, as we're talking about race and as we're talking about discrimination and prejudices, that we're telling people it's okay to fall short because there's this thing called grace from a guy named Jesus who died for you. Come know him. See what it means to live for him. See what it means to be loved by him. And this is a message that nobody else is going to hear except for the church. Secondly, avoid polarization. Really quickly, Tim Keller said 4 things. He said, the church talks about 4 things that society deems very interesting and deems very valuable. Those 4 things are caring for the poor, for racial injustice, for abortion, and for marriage between a man and a woman. All of these things have biblical values. But typically what we see in our society is that these two things are part of one platform and these two things are part of another platform. So you can get on board with racial injustice and caring for the poor, but when you talk about marriage, certain people step back. But we as Christians know that there's a biblical value for all four of these things. So in our world, please, what I would encourage you is to avoid being polarized, avoid having to choose between one or the other. And lastly, constantly point to Jesus. I'm going to leave us with this verse. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus Christ is the only one who is full of grace and full of truth. So when we try to figure out how to respond to our world, may we be a people who respond full of grace, but also don't back down from the biblical truth that God created each and every one of us in his image. We're called to share a biblical view to race, to what it means to be God's child, and to be in this world in a way that only the church can be right now. So I pray that helps in our discussion right now. And I'm going to give the floor to Danny